Hey everybody. So, we're a few days out from Earth Day now, and I think that it is a wonderful time to jump back in to the wheel of the year and try out my newer version of what last year was called the Rite of Tributaries, or the Day of the River. The theme for this holiday is water, and specifically the flow of water and how it feeds the natural world and the life around us and our own lives. It's a day where we can ask ourselves what more we can do to be more connected to and more in tune with the way that every action that's taken by ourselves, by our communities, or by other forces at play affects every other living thing on our planet. Just like last year, I'm not going to ask you to meditate or visualize with me for this one, because this holiday is more about focusing on what's present around us in our daily lives rather than taking a momentary escape from those lives to focus on a particular concept. So what we're going to do here is, I want to ask you, my audience, a series of questions. Don't feel obligated to answer them directly to me. You can just think them to yourselves, or write them down if this is something that you want to come back to later and really think about before committing to an answer. Because what we're here to do is to really think about how we connect with the natural world around us, and often how we often disconnect from that world in order to be swept up in what you might call human existence in the present sense. Now, I don't subscribe to the idea that humanity and nature are two separate things. I think that's a faulty way of viewing the world. And I think that worldview has done a lot of harm over the decades, especially since the Industrial Revolution, in making us feel like we are above and disconnected from every other form of life, and also from the cycles and resources of our planet. We can look at the energy crisis as one of the biggest blowbacks from this type of thinking. We tend to operate under the assumption that our resources are infinite, when in fact they are extraordinarily finite in many ways. And it's only recently, I think, that we've really started to reckon with just how finite some of those resources are. So, no dreamscape for this one. Let's focus on the here and now. And let's follow the river. The first question that I would like to ask you is, when is the last time that you have physically seen a frog? Some of us are fortunate enough to live in places where amphibian friends are abundant, but if you're like me and you live just a little bit a ways from, say, a reserve or a pond, it's probably been a while, hasn't it? See, amphibians are some of the most fragile animals in our ecosystems, and because of that, we can use them as sort of a jumping off point to see how healthy any given environment is. If there are a lot of amphibians and the water is clean and there isn't an overabundance of harmful algae or fungi or diseases that can be transferred through the water. Meanwhile, if there aren't a lot of amphibians, that speaks to the opposite. So I want you to think about your relationship with your local frogs, toads, newts, and other amphibian friends. How often do you see them? How often do you hear them? If you had to guess, how many do you think there are in your immediate surroundings? And is it the same number that you might have guessed, say, 5 years ago? 10 years ago? Up here in northeastern Ohio, where I live, there has been a significant decline in specifically frogs for the past decade or so. Every spring, when I was a kid, I used to listen to the spring peepers, as we call them, in our trees near the Black River, near our local ponds and lakes. Like cicadas, they make a bit of a cacophony, but honestly, I always found it to be very calming. And I would sit with my windows open at night and just listen to the frogs. Recently, though, past few years, I find that that sound is harder and harder to come by. Right now, it's already the end of April, and I haven't heard them at all. These changes to our environments tend to happen at a very gradual pace. You know, we don't wake up one morning and suddenly all the frogs are gone. And so it can be harder for us to keep track of these changes, and especially these declines, because, you know, you don't notice the difference between, say, 100 frogs and 75 frogs. None of us, besides our local scientists and probably a few people with a special interest, are really looking that closely at any given time. Because of that, we often don't notice these things until it's almost too late to do anything to help. So think about your local frogs, and if you don't like the numbers you're thinking of, maybe let's look into some things that we can do to help. If you have the means, there are always wildlife organizations that are often in need of donations or volunteer work, or, you know, just people around the area who are willing to care and talk to them about things you might be concerned about. Chemical spills, the use of water in a way that isn't conducive to healthy wildlife, things like that. And if you don't have the means, that's okay. Something that I've learned is that there's always something that you can do, even if it maybe kind of feels like nothing in the moment compared to what some others might be able to do. Sometimes just leaving out some water for thirsty animal friends can really make a difference. Since we've started leaving bowls of water out in our yard, we've seen a great increase in birds, insects, everything. You wouldn't think a couple bowls of water would really make that much of a difference, but trust me, they'll find it. The next question I want to ask you is, do you know where your drinking water comes from? And I don't mean just, do you know where the local plant is? I mean, do you know what specific water features are feeding into that? Which lakes, which rivers? It may seem to some of you like a silly question, or a, oh duh, of course I know that. But you'd be surprised how many people don't really think about where their water, their electricity, their basic resources are really coming from. And for those of you who might be in that place, I want to invite you to take a moment to really think about that. Where does your water come from? Does your city, county, state use some kind of dam to facilitate that water being brought to you? What kind of environmental factors go into that, and is the collection of that water being done in an ethical way? There have been a lot of talks in recent years about damming and the pros and cons of that process. The migration of salmon is, of course, one of the main concerns when it comes to that practice, but other fish migrations and other animals that would otherwise be making use of that water are also a concern. I think that we often look at these things from a very human-centric viewpoint, and that serves us in some ways, but does us a disservice in others, because all of those creatures that use those same water sources as us are part of what keeps our own lives in balance. For example, a forest that has grown used to the presence of beavers, building their dams and changing the waterways over thousands of years, they are adapted to that environment, and if we come in and we get rid of all the beavers, we put up a dam of our own, we are creating an environment that the rest of that place is no longer adapted to, and that can have a lot of negative consequences for tree species, obviously animal life, obviously aquatic life. And depending on what that environment is, what the balance has been, we can cause a lot of unintentional side effects from not putting enough thought into how much we're changing. Nature tends to change at a much slower pace than our modern societies do. And a lot of the damage we do by changing things too quickly. So think about where your water comes from. Think about what you could do to make sure that that water is still going to be there for generations to come. Maybe after this you can look into how that water is managed. Who's managing it? What interests they have. And do you agree with them? Many people say that water is a renewable resource, and they're not technically wrong, but drinkable water is definitely something that needs to be managed. And I think it's important for us to keep that in mind in the coming years as we reckon with the changes to our waterways. Here's a third question I want to ask you. Do you know where honeybees come from? Now, this question is mostly aimed at people here in the United States, because something that I've noticed is that a great many people, especially up here in the north, don't actually know that honeybees, or at least the species of honeybees that we are used to thinking of as honeybees, are actually European honeybees. Those bees are actually not our native species. They were brought over for honey production, and in many ways are akin to pigeons in being more feral than truly wild. I bring this up because when we're talking about conservation, and we're talking about maintaining the integrity of our local ecosystems, we really need to be paying more attention to introduced versus native species and the pros and cons of emboldening one species at the detriment of others, based on something as inconsequential in the largest sense as whether or not those species are directly useful for human beings. When we talk about saving the bees, and we talk about how vital bees are for pollination, for example, the image that often comes up in most people's minds is the image of a honeybee, when in fact, pollination is a niche that's shared between many species, and in North America specifically, we have a variety of native bees, both honey producing and not as much honey producing, that deserve that protection just as much as the European honeybees that make all of our delicious honey for our delicious honey toast and other goods. And, of course, bees aren't the only ones doing the job. There's kind of a meme among the English-speaking world that wasps are the spawn of the devil, whereas bees are cute little friends. And as somebody who has grown up in and around the countryside, where there are a lot of insects all the time, except in the winter, that's always kind of rubbed me the wrong way. Wasps and hornets, yeah, they sting, and it hurts, and it's awful. And if you're allergic to them, I understand being a little bit rightly terrified of that. But they're not flying demons in the way that popular culture has decided to portray them so often. And many of them do as much, if not more, pollination than those cute little fuzzy bees that we are all kind of programmed to like. So I think when we focus on our local environments and making them healthier, we should keep in mind that we can't judge a species based off whether they are particularly useful to us or particularly visually appealing to us. They don't need to be fluffy little friendly balls of joy to be worth protecting and to be worth respecting. So I want you to think about what kinds of pollinating insects you tend to see in your locality. Maybe you've got bees. You've probably got bees and wasps, maybe some hornets. Think about what species you see the most often, and are they a native species to where you are? And, cut yourself some slack. Maybe you're not too great at identifying the species. It's a learning curve, definitely. It's for something so small. But it's something to keep in mind. And for those of you who are privileged enough to be able to have a flower garden, or just flowering potted plants in general that have access to the outdoors, let's think about what we can do to entice a variety of little pollinating friends, rather than just the big name ones. Just these 3 questions should give you a decent starting point to think about how your local environment is doing. Let's take a moment to think about the answers that we've had so far. We have the amphibians in the water. We have the water sources and their management. And we have some of the little things that feed off of those systems and come into our world. We don't need a specific question for this next bit, but I want you to next take a moment to think about the diversity of the creatures that you see. Not particularly when you're going out into nature on purpose, but just when you're settled around your home, your block, your work, the places where you travel for your day-to-day life. What do you see while you're there? Chances are you've probably got a few birds that have made their way into the human world and are scavenging off of the things they find there. Most of us have some cute little mammals like raccoons, possums, rats. Yes, I think rats are cute. And you should too. If you're anything like me, you probably also see a collection of feral domesticated animals, maybe cats or dogs, pigeons. Depending on where you live, you might see parakeets or other birds that you tend to think more of as pet species, regardless of whether or not the ones sitting outside your window are actually domesticated in the traditional sense. Think about how many different kinds of creatures you see just within the span of, say, a normal work week. Now, think about how many you don't see. We've sort of encapsulated our lives into a false separatist world where we're aware that other species exist, but until they venture within our boundaries, we have a kind of out of sight, out of mind relationship with them. Just to give you an example of what I mean, up here in northeastern Ohio, we are technically within the range for porcupines. However, I have only ever seen a wild porcupine with my own 2 eyes once in 33 years. We also have a good population of foxes, but if you ask me how many times I've seen a fox, well, I can count that on one hand. And I'm always aware that these animals exist, and that they must be lurking right beyond the boundaries of my vision, but there's sort of a fog of deniability that exists when you know something is true, but you don't Just get to see it for yourself. And it's that fog that I think makes things like this holiday, like this idea, so important. Because it helps us dispel that fog. It makes us really sit there and think about the creatures that we might normally ignore because they're not visible in the way that other species may be. Depending on your lifestyle, depending on where you live, you might be very aware of all the different species that inhabit the same environment you do, or you might be completely oblivious to 75% or better of it 90% of the time, just because your schedule doesn't bring you into contact with them. The reason why we have these environmentalist holidays and these environmentalist videos and, lectures and talks and seminars is because they bring us out of our bubble and give us a chance to create opportunities for ourselves to really experience the connectiveness of our planet without that veneer of modern living keeping us away from it. Because at the end of the day, everything that flows out from the water is a part of our lives, whether we're aware of it or not, and what happens to them inevitably affects what happens to us. Those little frogs at the beginning are in many ways canaries in a coal mine. What starts with them inevitably spreads, and when that something is something bad, it can cause catastrophic drops in biodiversity that will eventually create inhospitable environments, even for large animals such as ourselves that seem so far removed from tiny little frogs. And as creatures capable of doing so, perhaps the only creatures on planet Earth capable of doing so, we should take the opportunity to keep track of and appreciate and protect those species that create the building blocks of life for us, and for so many others. Where that starts, at least in my book, is awareness. Proactivity. So this is me giving you an excuse to think a little bit more about those critters. Think about some frogs. Think about what you could do for those frogs. And for the bees and the wasps and the mice. Rabbits, deer, foxes. All the little critters rummaging around on the peripheral of our spaces. As with most things, I think sometimes that we feel powerless because we're coming to terms with the fact that the idea of individual action saving the world is kind of a farce a lot of the time. But here's the thing. If you start thinking about frogs, and you mention to the people in your life that you're thinking about frogs, sooner or later there's going to be 10, 20 people who are all thinking about frogs. Individual action isn't going to save the world, but it is where things start when it comes to larger movements. If every single person who is watching this video right now, when listening to me ramble, goes off and talks to some people in their lives about local biodiversity and what you can do about it, That's a multiplying number of people who all have the ability to make connections within their own communities. That's that many more people who can get into contact with their local conservation organizations, can volunteer some of their time to helping protect these species, can go to town halls and go to meetings and attend online seminars and put that knowledge to use, creating a better world alongside other people who are feeling the same. And that is what the Day of the River is about. That is why we trace the rivers and watch where they flow and see how all of those little tributaries spread out and connect every single living thing that exists. That's why we take time when we can to break through that fog of modern living and really appreciate where our place in the web of life is and what we can affect from where we stand in it. So, go forth and connect with nature. And thanks for joining me here today. I hope everyone had a wonderful Earth Day, and I hope you had a wonderful Day of the River, and I hope things continue to get better for all of us, big and small. See you next time.